Welcome to Backstage Money, where music and money collide. I'm your host, Jason K. Powers, and this is the show where we pull back the curtain on the business side and money side of life in the music industry. Every episode, we sit down with working musicians and industry insiders who have been figuring it out in the trenches, so you can learn from the people who are actually making it work. So today's guest, I am excited to have Franz Nicolai, a musician and writer living out in New York. He's been a member of the Cabaret Punk Orchestra, World Inferno Friendship Society, a keyboardist with what many call the world's best bar band, the Hold Steady, a touring member of Against Me, and has recorded and performed with dozens of other acts. His most recent book, Band People, was named one of Rolling Stone's best music books of 2024, and New Yorker called it one of the most honest books ever published about the rock and roll life. He also teaches at Bard College, writes for New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and beyond. And just recently, he sat in front of Congress and testified about the Live Nation Ticketmaster antitrust case, making the case that working musicians, not just superstars, are being squeezed by monopoly power in the live music industry. Franz, welcome to Backstage Money.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate you being on. You have a lot going on. No grass growing under your feet.
Try not to.
As we say, yeah, nothing. You're not getting bored. That's what it sounds like. Well, I wanted to dive in. I always love to start with just kind of how did you get into music to begin with? How did all this begin for you? I mean, you've been at this 30 years, right? Plus. And
I mean, how it began, as I'm told, is that I saw Yitzhak Perlman on Sesame Street and asked for a violin, and it went from there. I started playing piano around 6 years old, and I had one of these cassette box sets of, lives of the composers narrated with interspersed with their music. So I got into classical music, and then
nice.
One thing led to another, and I picked up guitar when I, as a middle schooler, as you do, and moved to New York and dove right in.
Yeah, and then took off from there. How'd you get into? Were you into writing early on? I mean,
I was into reading.
On a few books now.
Yeah, I was into reading. I read a lot, especially on tour. Once I started touring full time, there's a lot of time, travel time,
Sure.
in strange cities, and so I started making side quests of used bookstores and stocking my book with books.
Yeah.
Eventually, got inspired to start documenting my time on tours. Keeping more and more extensive tour diaries, as I realized that my memory was not going to be as reliable as I had thought it was going to be. And started getting some of that stuff published, and one thing led to another, and it seemed like the next challenge would be to attempt a book-length manuscript, and that became my first book, The Humorless Ladies of Border Control.
Well, I happened upon you picking up the copy of your book, Band People. And I went through it long before we even connected. I was like marking it, and I got all these little bookmark thingies in it, and I'm like, cool. I love, and so I really appreciated that book, and wanted to kind of, obviously for my listeners, I want you guys to check it out as well. But I wanted to kick this book off with a quote I read in here. It says, every band is a foreign country with its peculiar customs and dialects, slangs, and standards. But every band is also, when it works, a small business, a romance, an employer-employee dynamic, a hierarchy, a creative collaboration, and something between a family, siblings or cousins, something literally a gang. The rules governing those relationships and hierarchies are usually unspoken, unique to each collective of personalities, and have to be developed and negotiated from the ground up in each situation. I think that was one of my favorite things in the book. Just kind of, it really encapsulates bands, right? Just gives you this perspective on what band life is like.
Thanks. Yeah, I think bands, we take them for granted because they've been such a feature of the cultural landscape for 50 years now. But there was a time before rock bands, and it's it's a pretty unusual institution in all kinds of ways, and I guess in the ways that I tried to sum up in that paragraph.
Yeah, yeah, I love it. So when you came up with the idea for the book, I guess what question were you trying to answer? When you started writing the book.
Well, there's a way in which I was trying to answer what is this thing that I devoted the first 20 years of my life, my adult life, to.
Mhm.
Because
Mhm.
there was a period when I became a father and I came off the road, and coming off the road is, once you sort of take that plunge, it's hard to get off the treadmill, and it's really
Yeah.
discombobulating and disorienting. Um, not least because you have to make up all that money, and if you've been on the road for 10 years, that's a pretty long gap in your CV that you have to
Yeah.
explain and try to justify to people. And so, I guess you could call it a midlife crisis. um, and also I was trying to figure out what the next book project would be. And so this was a way of sort of, taking advantage of the time at home that I had to talk to other people who are in a similar situation and ask them, check it, because we don't often have these conversations across band lines. And to say, here's some things that I've thought about what my working life is like, and maybe you've thought about them too, but maybe you've answered them in different ways.
You use the phrase musical middle class. Can you
Yeah.
define that for our listeners?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think the conversation around music and the culture industry so much revolves around the very rich and the very famous, but that doesn't describe the vast majority of people who are engaged in making music. There's amateurs and semi-amateurs. There's people who don't expect to make a living out of it. Obviously, there's teenagers and college students and people in their early 20s who are going to try it for a little while and move on with their lives. And then there's this huge lumpy group of the rest of us who are, for better or for worse, professional musicians. And in this particular case, professional rock musicians,
Mhm.
in a world in which the giant sloshing pools of money that created the lifestyle that people imagine when they think of touring rock bands in the 70s and 80s and even into the 90s, that doesn't really exist anymore. And the people who are in touring rock bands, both sides have contracted, right? There aren't what the rock ecosystem is not creating giant bands anymore. Like, right? What are the stadium headlining bands? There hasn't been a new one probably since, I don't know, Foo Fighters, Green Day. Like, those guys are in their 60s. And so
Sure.
even the most successful rock bands now are living middle class lifestyles.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
and with all the sort of precarity and responsibility that comes with sustaining that.
Mhm. Mhm. So you talked to a lot of people and quoted a lot of people in the book. What was maybe one of the most surprising things you heard across all of those conversations?
um I guess the thing that surprised me, was that the questions on which people with total certainty came down on the opposite sides of a particular question. I would propose a question, um, like, how much do you prioritize being easy to get along with? Like, how much do you prioritize being a good hang? And some people would say, absolutely, that's the most important thing, more than being a good musician. And other people would, as if that was totally obvious. And then other people would say, absolutely, I prioritize being a more interesting musician over being easy to get along with. Like, I'd rather put my foot down on a piece of artistic principle than sort of go along to get along, as if that was equally obvious.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we've actually had a lot of conversations around that, idea in past episodes, and just be being a good person, right? To those around you and those that you're crossing paths with. I mean, yes, in relationship to your, um, fans, but also band members, right? And making it in the industry is and making those connections, and you can't really be a butthead about it. You want to keep making forward and keep building relationships, you know?
That's true. Although I guess there's a slight nuance to that, um, which is, just saying yes and being agreeable to everything.
Mhm.
Um, obviously people take people on tour that they want to hang out with, right? Because you're an hour on
Yeah.
stage or 2 hours on stage and 22 hours off stage.
Mhm.
On the other
Yeah.
hand, the idea of being agreeable and sharing a set of values can sometimes reinforce a set of values that you don't necessarily want to reproduce, right? So the question of gender imbalance in the rock world is one that comes up. And the women I spoke to, for the most part, with one exception, tended to take the stance of, look, it's not a problem. We all have the same stinky ass feet in the bunk beds. And I think that hidden behind that is a little bit of a self-selecting process that happened somewhat earlier in everyone's careers, right? Where
Yeah.
where if you're the kind of female musician or musician who, of any gender, I suppose, who objects to some of the ambient sexism that persists in the rock world, that some people may interpret that as, if you object to that vocally, some people may interpret that as being hard to get along with. And do you see what I
Okay.
mean?
Yep. Yep.
So there are ways in which, like, being perceived as easy to get along with or not easy to get along with can be a mask for other things that you may
Yeah.
not want to perpetuate.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, that's a good point. There's so many different environments, seems like, that people get put in, and it really, it's hard for, I think, most people to back up. And you have the general public perspective, and this, I think why I enjoyed this so much was it really gives you kind of an insider look. You're getting an insider opinion to other insiders, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, the other analogy that I make for rock bands is that it's like being in the military. That you're in a small group of people traveling in hostile territory, and you have to trust each other and have each other's back. And after you've done that for a bunch of years, you have experiences that you can only talk about with other people who've had those same experiences. That you sort of need a VFW hall for retired touring musicians. I mean, maybe that's what punk bars are, I suppose. But
sure, that's funny. So we have a whole chapter here on the artist and the artisan, money and credit.
Yeah.
In here, which I enjoyed. Talk to me a little bit about things you kind of unpacked in that chapter, and what you learned or what you wanted to kind of get across.
Yeah, I mean, this is where the rubber hits the road, right? Musicians have a hard time talking about money for the most part. The ones who some of the rough conclusions I came to is that there's a little bit of a genre divide and a class divide in terms of what kinds of musicians find it easier to value themselves or to talk openly about money. That tended to track onto people who came up through jazz or classical music and went through, went to conservatory or went to jazz school or had professionalized training that inculcated in them the ability to think of themselves as professionals who deserve to be paid as professionals, if you see what I mean. Whereas people who come up through punk and indie rock, the ideology is that, or was, that if to talk about money or to prioritize money was somehow to take away from your authenticity or to be focusing on the wrong kind of thing. And so a lot of those people never become comfortable thinking of themselves as professional musicians, I think, to their detriment in terms of having these discussions.
Sure.
It's an American pathology in general, the idea that it's rude to ask someone how much money they make.
Yeah.
But I think
Mhm.
it's specifically a problem. It's particularly a problem in the arts, in the culture industries, where such a priority is put on art over commerce,
Mhm.
as if those
Mhm.
things can be divided.
Yeah. Yeah. You have a quote in here. Rick Steff says, "If musicians were better about money, we would be accountants." Good.
One of
You
the
know.
things I teach college, I teach music students, and in my songwriting workshop, I always take a class or two and walk them through the business of songwriting. Like, here's how publishing works. Here's where you need to register your songs. Here's how copyright is understood in the American legal system. And also, here's how to do, here's some basic things to know about filing freelancer taxes. That's the sort of thing
Uh,
you never get even in music school.
yeah. Yeah. So on the topic then of making money and maybe even keeping the money you're making, right? What have you found to be useful or helpful in your own career and that you've gleaned from others, even in writing this book?
Well, that it's important to hold a line around that. I mean, this is not news to anyone who's read books about the rock industry, but
Mhm.
songwriting credits are important. And if you can get some songwriting credits and hang on to some songwriting credits, and whenever possible, the publishing, that's extremely valuable stuff, right? That songwriting credits and publishing is where, and the disparity within bands between those who have and those who don't is one of the main things that historically has introduced class tension within a band,
Mhm.
because it's an income stream that's available to those who have access to the songwriting that's not available to others in the band. Um, and so, as I lay out in the book, one of the ways that manifests itself, because of the way songwriting was understood legally, um, going back to the late 19th century, when the standard model was a songwriting team where you would have generally two guys, usually guys, one person who wrote the melody and the chords, and the other person who wrote the lyrics. And so songwriting copyright ever since then has been fundamentally legally based on the kind of on lyrics and a melody, right, that can be written down in a lead sheet. Um, and the rise of rock bands after the Beatles, with the expectation that they were going to be creating their own material, doesn't map very neatly um, into that format,
Mhm.
because the expectation is that, four or five people staring at each other in a practice room, each contributing various parts, and then call it, and then it gets very fuzzy between what's arranging, what's songwriting. Um,
Mhm.
does the person who write the lyrics automatically take 50% of the song, and then everyone else splits the other 50%? You try to split it equally. There's no tried and true model for how that works.
Mhm.
And so, for example, in terms of the things that are legally creditable about songwriting, drummers, for example, are structurally excluded because of the instrument they play. They're not
Sure.
contributing melodic or harmonic elements. And so
Sure.
you have to be in a particularly generous band for drummers to have access to songwriting credits.
Mhm. Mhm. So unpack that a little bit for those who obviously haven't read the book and are hearing this idea, maybe first time, kind of how the dynamics of, you know, you have the songwriting credits, which then produces what that produces over the long run versus just say touring, right? I think the contrast was just touring and you get the short-term pay versus the long-term pay and things like this.
Yeah, I mean, this gets a little bit into the weeds, but it is one of those things. Adam Gopnik in the New Yorker has said a couple times that, reading the history of band breakups always ends up being a story about publishing, about how publishing works.
Mhm.
Um,
Sure.
so there are two kinds of copyright that you can have on let's say you make an album of original material. There's a copyright that's based on the recording of those songs. That's called the master. And then you have the copyright on the songs in the abstract, and that's the songwriting and publishing. So, for example, and those are two different royalty streams. And the royalties from the master go either to the recording artist, i.e., the band, as the people who recorded the songs, or very often to the record label, because it's premised on who paid for the recording, right? If you paid for the studio time, you own that recording. So that's the sort of that royalty stream, at least in theory, can go to the band and be split evenly among the band. The songwriting credit refers to the lyrics and the song in the abstract, divorced from a particular performance of it. So in a famous example, right, Jimi Hendrix records All Along the Watchtower, which was written by Bob Dylan. So the royalties for the master recording go to the when that song gets played on the radio. I won't get into the weeds on radio royalties, but in theory, when that recording is played in public, the royalties for the master go to the Jimi Hendrix estate, and the royalties for the songwriting go to Bob Dylan, right? So if you're in a band, and you don't split the songwriting royalties equally, let's say you have, in the very traditional model, a guitarist and a singer who are writing all the songs, they have an entirely separate and royalty stream that comes to them that does not come to the rest of the members of the band. So that's additional money. If they get an advance from a publishing company, an advance on those royalties, that advance often comes sooner than the record royalties for record sales trickle in. And so for a band on the verge of having their first big hit, those songwriters will get their couple $100,000 before the rest of the band does. And so that can create a lot of resentment. Also, what's the other big revenue stream, right? It's performance. It's touring money. It's the money you get from ticket sales. It's the money you get from merchandise that you're selling at your concerts. That money obviously only comes when you're an active band, when you're actively touring. Meanwhile, if you're lucky enough to have songs being played on the radio or played on television, that in theory continues whether you're on the road or not. So if you take a year off to write a new record, there's no income coming in for your support musicians, but the songwriters are still getting money in the mail. The band breaks up, doesn't do anything for 20 years. All that performance royalties go away, but the songwriting royalties keep on coming in. People call that mail money.
Mail money.
So that's that's the musician's 401k. You can't live on it for the most part unless you have a big hit. But a radio hit, right? That's what separates your mid-level indie bands from your bigger bands is having a radio hit. And that gets you into a different level of songwriting royalties, but that's the difference.
Yeah. I think that's a great consideration that many forget in the industry. We kind of just, because the conversation these days is really focused on get out there and do the live music, right? Because of the streaming issue right now with streaming and the lack of pay in the streaming world that they're getting, or the requirement to get anything substantial, and now it becomes live music and merch, right? And then everything else kind of gets free.
Yeah, I mean, even merch is a little bit of a problem. There's the vaunted indie touring circuit of the 80s, 90s, aughts was essentially premised on the idea that you could make a CD for $1 and sell it for 10. That right? Like right. if you're booking a tour, you knew in advance what your guarantees would be. You could sort of do the math on how much gas you were going to spend and how much if you rented a van, right? So you could sort of plan a break-even tour based on that. What you couldn't plan is how much merch you were going to sell. So that was your profit for the tour, was that $1 CD that you sold for 10. and
Yeah.
they were light and compact, and you could travel with hundreds of them, and that's what made those tours work. And then once that piece went away, that's a piece of the difficulty in touring, the collapse in touring, that I don't see people focus on as much. But to me, that's the crucial. That's the linchpin that held it all together.
You mentioned radio. What's your opinions right now on, we have this Fair Play, Fair Pay Act that's been out there. And I think didn't you get
I was
involved
part of
back
a
in
lobbying
acting
team,
that?
10 years ago. I think
Yeah.
when they reintroduced that bill under a different name, this is a loophole in radio performance world. This, again, I don't know, this is a little in the weeds, but maybe your listeners are interested.
You like weeds.
So it's a long-standing loophole in the way royalties get paid for radio play, such that the songwriter, that's why I hedged a little bit around the Jimi Hendrix example, because the status quo in the United States is that performers do not get paid royalties when their recordings are played on the radio. Only the songwriter gets paid the royalties, because when the royalties were established, when the radio industry was coming into being in the 1940s and 50s, in terms of playing recordings on the radio, obviously radio existed before that, but you had live musicians up until the post-war era. The assumption was that getting your record played on the radio was free advertising, was promotion, and therefore you shouldn't get an additional royalty. That the radio stations since they were providing this free advertising for your record, they shouldn't have to pay an additional royalty. And that prerogative has been jealously defended by Clear Channel. And there's bipartisan backing at every step for closing that loophole, so performers can get paid when their recordings are played on the radio. That royalty exists for satellite radio, because satellite as a new technology wasn't grandfathered into this royalty structure. And so it's only for your terrestrial FM radio that this loophole exists.
Yeah.
But every time the bill comes up, Clear Channel pays a bunch of lobbyists a lot of money, and it dies.
Yeah, it was interesting. I listened to the last round of it, and you had Gene Simmons on there, and it was pretty interesting. I think for the listeners, it's worth a look if you haven't looked into it. Just seeing that conversation.
I mean, it's an interesting issue. Music rights bills in Congress have an unusually bipartisan appeal, in sometimes unexpected ways. So in 2016, when I went to lobby for the Fair Play, Fair Pay Act, the sponsors, I think, were on the Senate side, Al Franken on one side and Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee on the other, because she represents Nashville, and the musicians in Nashville really care about that. And on the House side, I forget who the Democratic sponsor was, but the Republican sponsor was Darrell Issa of Southern California, who was particularly interested in intellectual property issues because he made his fortune on a car alarm patent, on the protected by Viper car alarm patent. And so he had a particular interest in getting people paid for intellectual property.
Yep. And that actually, to clarify, that it was the Fair Play, Fair Pay Act, which has been updated. Now they call it the American Music Fairness Act, I think now.
Right. Yeah. Yep.
They got reintroduced. Yep. So speaking of Congress, you had a recent visit just not too long ago, 2 weeks ago or something like that?
Yeah, 2 weeks.
You gave a congressional statement, and you said this was regarding the Ticketmaster Live Nation issue. And, you said, you gave a statement, you said artists are the face of ticket sales and fans can't complain to Ticketmaster. They could come to your Facebook page instead. is how you put it, and so give me some examples of what you hear. I think we all know like what's going on. What have you found to be the most problematic issue in kind of dealing with that kind of thing where you're having to play middleman, artists are having to play middleman in effect and calm down the bands,
Sure. Well, I'll give you an example from our experience, from the Hold Steady's experience, which is that, we do these weekends where we set up a residency in a particular town, and we'll have multiple nights of shows, but we'll also have afternoon activities. We'll do guitar workshops. We'll do pub quizzes that the band attends. We'll do meet and greet sound checks, and stuff like merch bundles. And so the problem was when we played venues that Ticketmaster, that were exclusively Ticketmaster venues. Ticketmaster will come in and say you can make these deals with venues, say you can only use us, as opposed to eTix or some of the other independent ticketing companies. And it hadn't always been this way. This was a post-pandemic policy that they. And because Ticketmaster, an important thing to know about their business model, I think a lot of people can intuit this, is that they're really making their money off the fees, right? The fees that get added, the transaction fees that get added at the end of a transaction, and are sometimes quite opaque. So they made it so that you couldn't sell bundles. Right. So if a person wanted to come see 2 shows and a guitar workshop and buy a merch bundle, they would have to pay a separate fee for each of those items, including the merch bundle, which Ticketmaster had no role in manufacturing or fulfilling. Right. All that was like they ran the credit card, and then somebody brought a printout of their ticket to our merch guy and gets handed a poster and a T-shirt. And these were really adding up. We have people who want to come to all the shows and, all the events and get the merch bundle. And they were coming to our management and saying, look, I'm paying, it's a $50 concert, but I'm paying $45 in fees for all this stuff. You got to do something.
Yeah. Right.
And you're caught in a bind, right? Because you don't have unlimited venue options or promoter options in a particular city. Right. Like, sometimes you have to work with a particular person, or you've always worked with a particular person, or there's only one, 1,000 cap room and that's where you're going to be. But they have a deal with Ticketmaster. So what are you going to do? It took us a couple of years to figure out the best workaround. And again, like, not to get too deep in the weeds, what we eventually settled on is not an ideal solution. But it is true that in any ticketing situation, including a Ticketmaster situation, the artist can set aside 10% of the house to do whatever we want with. We could sell those tickets for $500 if we wanted. We could give them away if we wanted. And so what we ended up doing was setting up a fan club. Pearl Jam really innovated this model, where you set up a subscription model fan club, and then give those fans access to the bundles. Because what we figured is the people who are buying multiple things on these weekends are already the people who are super fans. And so if we price it such that they're going to pay a monthly amount or an annual amount, that's going to be way less than they were already spending on us. And we can make it so they're not spending these fees, because we can bundle, if it's a 1,000 cap room, we have 100 tickets that we can offer to those people with their merch bundles and whatever, which is a pretty good solution. But then you have to explain it to people, and some people, people don't want to be bothered with the behind the scenes, and we don't want to bother them with the behind the scenes. Frankly, we don't even want to be thinking about this. This is not our, don't want to deal with it. Yeah. But there's some percentage of the fan base that freaked out and, said, why do we have to buy a subscription to our band? And you can explain it and say, look, we're caught in the middle here, and this is a solution that we can come up with. So we control a little bit of this, and we can save money for
Yep.
the people who want to do that. But then you're already on the back foot once you're trying to explain yourself. So that's a real life example.
Well, I think in the book, or not in the book, I'm sorry, in your statements, you kind of describe this as a triple fee situation, right? A fan trying to attend a show, attend meet and greet, buy the merch bundle, get charged 3 separate fees.
Yeah, I mean, there are other places
Right.
where you can see that happen. So, for example, Ticketmaster's interest in the resale market is an example of that, because they can collect a fee on the initial purchase of the fee, and then if it goes to resale, then they can collect another fee from the seller, and then another fee from the buyer. So now they've collected 3 fees for the same ticket, even as the face value of the price goes through the roof, and that difference doesn't go to the artist.
Right. In your statement,
Which is why one of the policies that we're asking for is a cap on resale at or just above face value.
Yeah, which they have in Europe, right?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
And various states are passing those laws. I think Vermont just passed that. But of course, these are tours and corporations that cross state lines. So I don't know exactly what the enforcement mechanism is.
Right. Seems like there's quite a bit yet to unpack for them.
There's a lot, yeah.
You had called Live Nation the epitome of the kind of monopolistic power antitrust law was created to address. You think Congress actually heard you?
I think that that I was facing a friendly panel of Congress people who are already on board with that with that position, and we're mostly looking for people to ventriloquize some sound bites to support their existing position. I mean, a part of this is because your listeners may know that Live Nation was declared an illegal monopoly by a judge in New York, but then they hired people who are close to the administration to go directly to the top of DOJ and got a sweetheart settlement out of it, which is Roger Alford, who was on the panel with me, was high up at DOJ prosecuting this antitrust case, and he got fired for objecting to this settlement, and has been making the rounds, calling it, I think rightly so, an example of corruption in the highest levels of the administration and the Department of Justice. So yeah, I think people like Raskin and Blumenthal do agree that that this it's as clear cut an example of a monopoly in a particular business as you can get. Given that this corporation includes venues and ticketing and promotion and artist management.
Yeah, I'll be curious to see where it heads. I mean, I think it's headed the right direction. People are listening. People are looking at it and paying attention to it now. And it
depends on the state attorneys general, right? So the feds have settled, but a consortium of state attorneys general, a couple dozen, have said that they're going to continue to prosecute this.
Yeah. So winding down, what do you wish someone had told you earlier in your career about the business side of music?
Well, I think as young musicians go, I was pretty well informed, and I was able to advocate for myself for things like songwriting credits. I did take the advance on publishing deals on 2 Hold Steady Records for my small percentage of the songwriting on 2 Hold Steady Records, Boys and Girls in America, and Stay Positive. And I kind of wish I hadn't. In retrospect, the advance was $10,000 for each of those records, which I really needed at the time.
Yeah.
But in retrospect, it was giving away a lot for that 10 grand in 2006.
Mhm.
So,
Sure.
I would certainly encourage young musicians to take the long view when people are offering to advance you money.
Yeah. Yeah. That think long range perspective is hard in the
Very
music.
hard.
It really is. We see it all the time in conversations we have about the finances because of the ebb and flow of income. It gets very difficult to think long range, and you kind of have to be systematic about it in a way, or disciplined might be a better word for it.
Yeah, I mean, you don't know how things turn out. Yeah,
Yeah.
at that stage in my 20s, it was like, I
Mhm.
can barely pay my rent. The band is doing pretty well, but who knows if that's going to continue.
Mhm.
And I need to pay off my credit card, so I guess I'll just sign that
Right.
that
Yeah.
contract.
Yeah. Yeah. So, similar question. What do you think, or what do you see musicians doing wrong financially that you'd push back on, that you would say you need to probably rather start doing this? I mean, we kind of touched on the not thinking long range, but are there
Well,
some
I also think, it
things?
seems like people don't have the money conversation until it's too late, by which I mean until there's actually money on the table.
Mhm.
Um, and I think a lot of bands, especially if they are serious about being a band, owe it to themselves to have that conversation around, especially songwriting, when before anybody cares.
Yeah.
Um, I say in the book, there are a couple bands that are sort of spoken about in kind of mythical terms by other band people because they made this agreement early on that they would share the songwriting equally, and they actually stuck to it.
Mhm.
So REM, Radiohead, U2, um, and I think it's no accident that these are also bands that had multi-decade careers with very little public acrimony because they all got rich at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't want to, people can make whatever agreements they want to make about songwriting, but if you're serious about being a band, I think you have to take a good hard look at that equal or roughly equal split.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, that's great. All right. Tell me, where can people find you? Where can they find the book?
I mean, the easiest clearinghouse for anything I'm doing is my website, franznicolay.com, FRANZNICOLAY.com. Various social accounts are all Franz Nicolay, Blue Sky, Instagram, Facebook. That's the three books are Band People, which we've been talking about. The first one was The Humorless Ladies of Border Control, which was a travel book about my touring in the former communist worlds in 2012 to 2014, Russia, Ukraine, Mongolia, Eastern Europe. And the middle book, which is a novel called Someone Should Pay for Your Pain, which is also about a touring musician.
Cool. Love it. And we'll have links in the descriptions of the episodes. So for our listeners, you can check that out too. He's also got a newsletter, Piano
Yes,
Fighter.
pianofighter.substack.com, coming out
Yep.
every bi-weekly, twice a month.
Yep. Yep. Which I get and I enjoy. And we'll put those links all in the descriptions. So, all right, let's wind it down. We usually wrap up each episode with a segment called Final Riffs. It's just rapid fire questions, rapid fire answers. You ready?
Sure.
All right. First concert you ever went to?
First concert I ever went to was U2 Zoo Tour at Foxborough Stadium
Fun.
in 92, probably.
Yeah. Nice. Biggest musical influence growing up?
The band, Bob Dylan and the band,
Okay.
both musically and sort of conceptually.
Yeah.
Looking at the cover of the Basement Tapes and thinking those guys look cool.
Nice. First album you ever bought, you remember?
First album I bought with my own money. It was cassettes in, I don't know, 7th grade. So it would have been some combination of Poison, Flesh and Blood.
Yeah.
I think it might have AC/DC, Razor's Edge, something like that.
The good hair days, right?
Yeah.
Non-music hobby or passion of yours?
I'm a big baseball fan. I follow baseball real close.
Okay. Got your favorite team?
Red Sox. I'm a
Red
good New
Sox.
Englander. Yeah.
Right. If you weren't doing music, what would you be doing?
I'd be a librarian.
Oh yeah.
I had a day job at one point in my early 20s that involved going to the in the stacks in the back collections at the New York Public Library's Performing Arts collection. I just loved it so much. So when I came off the road, I seriously considered getting a library sciences degree.
Very nice. All right, Franz, thank you so much for being on. This has been, I think, a very important conversation for people that we've had on here. And you put to words, you know, what so many working musicians feel but can't articulate, I think. And then you went and said it in front of Congress. And I think that's unique in your position, you know, and that's great to keep advocating for the music industry like that. I love how you wrote. Yep. I love how you wrote in the book about, you know, we talked about it, publishing royalties and the mail money, and about how that's about as close to a 401k as a band person is likely to get. And you quoted Simon Frith, said paying dues may be a collective affair, making it is not. And I liked that line. It just kind of makes you think, how do we need to think and how we approach things? I love the thinking long range idea. I preach it all the time. Think long range, think long range, think long range. You know, everyone else's income kind of tends to fade if they're not careful when the touring stops. You know, and most people, I think, forget all of these things. We're not thinking and looking at the whole picture. We get tunnel visioned into it, right? And so that's one of the things, you know, for our listeners, that is one of the things that I help musicians do, is kind of building their own cash flow system that doesn't depend on whether your name is on the songwriting credits. It's what to do with the money once you've made it and how to keep it. So thank you for being on, guys. Go grab a copy of Band People. Put the links in the show notes, and subscribe to Piano Fighter newsletter at pianofighter.substack.com, and everything else we'll put in there. You can link to franznicolai.com. And if today's conversation got you thinking about your own financial picture, head on over to my site at 1024wealth.com/music, grab the free guide, and let's talk. I'm JCK Powers. This is Backstage Money, where music and money collide. And we'll see you next time. Thanks so much, Franz.
Thank you.